good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, based on where you are. I think we're covering most of the world today with our audience as well as our speakers. My name is Aaron Malas. I'm Associate Director in the Center for Regional Economics at the Milken Institute, based in Santa Monica, California. Really excited to welcome you to today's event. Very excited about the partnership that we at the Milken Institute have with our colleagues at Global Wonks. I want to very quickly thank my colleague Diana Herman, as well as my counterpart Bilal Baloch from Global Wonks. This is the second event in a joint webinar series that we've organized to discuss the future of work. Very excited about this series and the collaboration that we have to discuss some key issues when it comes to where the future of work is going to take us, going a bit beyond the headlines on some key issues. Our first event in July had covered the future of offices. Today we'll be talking about the gig economy and where we're headed, both here in the United States as well as around the world. As many of you know, here in California, in about 5 weeks, we'll be voting on a ballot initiative, Prop 22, that covers the gig economy specifically, and whether transportation and delivery companies are responsible to gig workers as employees or independent contractors. But this issue is obviously a lot bigger, so we're very excited to have speakers from around the world with us today. Very excited for our discussion and really look forward to not only this event, but other great programming that we'll have coming down the line with our partners at Global Wonks. So thank you again to everyone, and I'll hand it over to today's moderator, Terry Mcbride.
Great, Aaron, thank you very much. I'm Terry Mcbride. I am a VP for HR for EMEA and APAC for a tech firm called Protegrity. Before joining Protegrity, I also served in a number of roles in consulting, focusing on private equity and also portfolio companies, very specifically looking at human capital and how do we make sure individuals and organizations are bringing the best of themselves to work. So it's with that background that I am so delighted to be engaging with this topic when we think about the gig economy. So when we think about the gig economy, it's really thinking about, is it a great equalizer or are we deepening the divide? And should workers in the gig economy be treated as employees subject to expanded legal protections or as independent contractors really responsible for the greater proportion of their own welfare? So today's panel, and I'm delighted with the panelists, will discuss the status of the issue in the US and also around the world. So as political jurisdictions consider new legislation, are they more likely to treat gig workers as employees or independent contractors? In the meantime, how do companies and workers manage their uncertain status? So I'm delighted to have today here Janine Berg, who is a senior economist with the International Labor Organization, Ana Lucia Cepeda, founder and CEO from Bolsa Rosa, and then Xian Ko, who's general partner and co-founder for Hustle Fund. So that's the briefest of introductions. I'm going to turn this over to Ana Lucia, first of all, for a 5-minute introduction, and then we'll pass that around, and then we'll start with some of the questions. So over to you, Ana Lucia.
Hi, Terry. Thank you so much, and thank you for the Milken Institute and Global Wonks for this invitation. I'm Ana Lucia. I'm from Mexico, so I'll be discussing a little bit about the gig economy from the Mexican and Latin American point of view. I have a company where we connect talent in flex-time jobs, and we also help companies implement flex-time strategies in their workplace, and also to build high performance organizations. And I've been working on this topic for almost 8 years, and it's a big relevant part of the gig economy because flexibility, it's a big enabler for the gig economy as well. So it's what we're going to discuss today. Is it only gig economy? Does it have to do with remote work as well, flexibility, and all of this? So thank you so much. And I'm from Mexico, and best regards from warm Mexico over here.
Great, thank you, Ana. Janine?
Hi, so thank you very much for the invitation to be with all of you. It's really a pleasure. My name's Janine Berg. I'm an economist with the International Labor Organization. The International Labor Organization is a UN agency that we promote workers' rights and social justice. We were founded in 1919, so we actually had our centenary last year. And since our establishment, we've been, arguing for protections for workers to ensure that when you go to work, you have a safe and healthy workplace, that you're not discriminated against, that you have equal pay for equal amount of work, a whole slew of protections. We pass what we call international labor conventions and international labor recommendations that provides guidance to our member states on the design of labor laws and labor market policies. We have 187 countries that are member states. So all of you, I'm sure, participate in your governments, participate in, are members of the ILO. And the ILO is also a tripartite organization, which means that we have representatives from the business community and from trade unions. And through a process of social dialogue, we arrive at these recommendations and conventions. Now, the gig economy. One of the things that, this is an area that's been of great interest to us because we've been studying the future of work and how work is evolving. And it's been fascinating for me as somebody who's studied labor history and who sees kind of the emergence of new forms of casual work, but kind of with a new tool in how we use casual work. Flexibility is a wonderful thing. We promote this in the ILO. There's many ways to have flexibility, but flexibility shouldn't be synonymous with a lack of labor protections for workers. So really the trick isn't so much, is it a worker, what is the legal classification of a worker, but how can we assume that regardless of a person's contractual status, that they have the protections that they need. And so this is the way that we've really been approaching the issues. Depending on different countries and their laws in place, you might have a country where you have independent contractors. You might have a third category. So you see in Canada, in Germany, in Italy, for example, also in the UK, a third category of worker that has certain amounts of protections. Or you have also the employee. So it depends really on the type of legislation in the country. But what we're trying to advocate is that regardless of how you classify workers, we need to find ways to extend protections of workers so that they don't that they don't have all the risk if there is, if there's problems in the world of work. So I think I'll stop here because it's probably enough of an introduction.
Great, thank you, Janine. Shan?
Hi, I'm Sheehan Ko. I'm the managing partner for Hustle Fund. It's a pre-seed fund based between Singapore and San Francisco. And I think we come at the topic from the perspective of people who are seeing company formation at the earliest stages, where people are making decisions about labor, how to set up the labor, where they should hire from, and how they should contract with them. And I think we wholeheartedly agree with Janine that your contractual status shouldn't impact your rights. And I think a lot of the issues in the US actually stem from the fact that a lot of rights like health insurance, unemployment benefits pre-COVID were actually tied to your employer. And I think the latest stat is something like 30% of the US workforce is actually in this sort of freelance or contract state. And so it seems sort of insane that we should tie these things to something that isn't actually that material. And I think it's interesting, I did look up a few statistics prior to this. I used to work at NerdWallet, which is a personal finance company in the US. And so we did a lot of things on sort of retirement savings, health insurance, unemployment insurance. So I had a vague memory of this stat, but basically, even for employers who do offer, retirement savings, in the private sector, only about half of people actually access that. And of the people, who do access it, a lot of companies actually don't have very good retirement plans. And so I think there are a lot of structural issues around what we call freelance and contract work that are related to historical decisions that have been made on how we tie contractual employer status with benefits. I really liked, Terry, your provocative question at the start of the session, which is, is it a great equalizer or are we just deepening the divide? And I think kind of just depends on who you are, right? I would say that if you are someone in a developed market, it probably feels like it's deepening the divide. But if you're running a dev shop in the Ukraine, it's pretty awesome. And you're getting access to the types of work and opportunities that you would not have been able to see 10 or 15 years ago. And part of that is people's higher willingness to engage with contractors and freelancers. And of course, technology enabling us to close those distances with a lower amount of overhead and friction. And so, yeah, I think I'll close it there and looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Thanks, Shan. Thanks, Ana Lucia. Thanks, Janine. So you raised so many interesting points. If we start at the most fundamental one is gig working allowing labor flexibility, or is it diminished corporate responsibility? And I think it would be interesting if we could even discuss this at the level of, does this vary by location? So do we have different responsibilities based on the local labor market, or do we have a universal responsibility to safe labor? So I'll open it up to Ana Lucia again.
Thank you, Terry. Well, I think, as you mentioned, like it depends on how you look at it. I think there's always like two points of view to all of these types of things. It gives us, I think, like it gives us more flexibility. I mean, I know the economy right now is really oriented towards the service industry, Uber, Lyft, Corner Shop, all of these apps that have people on service that is on demand. I know it's really oriented to this. The pandemic has, of course, scaled these types of apps and these types of gigs for this type of people that, of course, they're mostly not covered with health insurance or anything else. So it's where this affects. But also, if this keeps growing, because it's going to be a trend that will be maintained right now, like right now and during the next years, it will be maintained. I don't think we're going to be back to normal during the next year or so. So if this maintains, I think companies have to start adjusting towards giving these people their rights. At least here in Mexico, you have to give the minimum wage in the Social Security, like in the healthcare of the government. So most of them, if you have, depends on your contract, you have access to healthcare of the government. And they pay you like the minimum wage through that. And of course, the rest of the money or whatever by contract. So that's also like, at least here, it's a way to protect the employee, that they have access to healthcare in a way. But also, if this gig economy continues and grows in the professional environment with all the web designers, I mean, I have contracted in my company gigs of people that have done something of technology, designing, marketing, all of those. And I think also this is going to increase enormously during the next years. It's going to be scaled a lot. So here it's the big question. I mean, how are the corporations, are we going to adjust to be able to have access to this top talent that wants to give us their time to do a gig, to do a project for us? Because I mean, of course it helps us, because I pay for a project, but I don't maintain that cost forever, permanently. I just have the talent and the access to it for a few months. And it's supposed to be better paid off than it to be a permanent employment, so that person can have its own healthcare insurance and all of the rest of things with all of its gigs. So it's a big, like, we have to adapt, either the corporations, because the offboarding process is going to be different. The service area where they're not well covered, they have to be covered at least with the healthcare of the government and all of these things. But I think the mentality of flexibility is what people are looking for now, either in a big organization or in a gig project, in being an Uber driver. What we look for now is for flexibility in the workplace. Either it's in the mindset, in how we lead people. So we have to adapt our working environments towards this flexible environment. And either it's by gigs or it's by having a permanent job, but under this environment, I think. Terry, I think you're on off speaker.
That is the phrase for 2020, you're on mute. Thank you. So you've raised really, really good points. And Janine, I'd ask you to respond to a couple of those in there, both flexibility, but also corporate responsibility. So it's terrific that people get labor flexibility, but is this just a way to offload risk to individual workers?
Okay, so this is where to me, flexibility doesn't need to be the same thing as risk. Okay, and so one of the main things that we advocate, and which you see in a lot of national labor legislation, is the idea of equal treatment. So if you're a part-time worker, for example, in the Netherlands is referred to as the world's first part-time economy. Over 50% of women, something about 70% of women work part-time, and about 25, 30% of men work part-time. So over 50% of the labor force works fewer than 40 hours a week, around 25, 30 hours a week. Now, if you're a part-time worker in the Netherlands, you get all the same benefits as if you were a full-time worker in the Netherlands, obviously pro rata, but you have the same rights. You can join a union. You have the same rights to a safe and healthy workplace. You have the same exact contractual status, essentially. So when you have this some sort of equal treatment in your laws, it means then that companies use flexible contracts because they need the flexibility and not because it's cheaper. Because when companies use contracts because they're cheaper, because the labor legislation, the Social Security legislation is designed where there are certain thresholds that, you only have to contribute to Social Security if the person works more than 20 hours a week, or if the person works for longer than 3 months. When you have these thresholds built in, what you do is that you create an incentive for companies then to use these kind of more precarious forms of contracts. So you don't want to do that. You want to treat all sorts of contractual arrangements the same. And then you can have the flexibility that you need. So this is really, that's kind of the ideal that we want to move to. And I think from a national perspective, that's something that can be easily done. What's very difficult, and the reason why we've been studying so much the platform economy at the ILO recently, is because it has a whole new sticking point, which is, and I'm not talking about the Uber and the delivery services, because those can be regulated within the jurisdiction of where the person is working. Okay, so if you're driving in San Francisco, then you're regulated by San Francisco laws or California laws, right? So that's fine. But if you're working on a crowdsourcing platform or a freelancing platform, and you live in Mexico and the platform's in California and the client's in Germany, it's very tricky, because then you get these conflict of law issues. So who's responsible? How do you make sure that that person's paying the minimum wage? How do you allow these people to join a trade union and have a collective negotiation if they want to? And this is where we're seeing a limit in the way our kind of international and national labor legislation has been designed. So I think this is really the challenge for the future.
Great, thanks, Janine. So Xian, at the very beginning, you brought up some really interesting points about the benefits of this global flexibility. What happens when people fall between the cracks, or we have legislation that doesn't cover people? And it's great to say that some of these benefits shouldn't be tied to employment, but unfortunately in many societies they are. So how do we wrestle with that question of, is it about flexibility or is it about people's responsibility?
It's a tough question, but I also think, I don't know, maybe, I'm a capitalist, right? So I think you end up just paying for what you think the work is worth. And everyone sort of thinks about, well, what is the most work I can get for the least amount I want to pay? And it might not be one time, it might be a multi-turn transaction, right? So I might think giving someone a better contract over a longer period of time actually will cost me less over time, because I have fewer search costs, I have fewer training costs and things like that. And so I would want that person to be a full-time employee. And I actually use the platforms like TopToll or Upwork or whatnot to try people out on a contract. And if I like them, I want to make them a full-time employee, because I do see benefits to doing that. But I think in general, at least, contractors, you do pay them a little bit more on a per hour basis because you don't cover their healthcare and benefits. And you do have to take into account those sorts of things. And I don't know if you can appeal to people's sort of altruism to do that. If you can't have a law that compels their behavior in wherever they're being, whatever jurisdiction they're under, then, I do really think it is kind of this competition for who is going to find and identify the best talent and at a price that works for their business. So it is, I think, harsh, but I think this is where the role of government has to play a role here, right? So I think, Janine, you were saying like, hey, at a national level, like we shouldn't preference certain types of contracts over others. And I think that's absolutely correct. And at the same time, I think at a national level, you have to think about like, well, what is the level of health insurance we believe our citizens should have, right? Like, is it okay that, some percentage of our citizens are not covered? And I think that's a conversation that societies have to have and make decisions about how they want to allocate their resources towards it. So in Singapore, everyone has access to national health care. And so that is like less of a concern. The Ministry of Manpower is looking into how to provide more retirement savings, and the trade unions are trying to figure out, can they unionize some of the gig workers for better negotiation. But I think it is a real threat, right? Because I think the other part of it that is like related but not the same is like this immigration question, right? So even before you could access global talent, people also worry about cheaper labor coming into their country and taking their jobs. And I think at the end of the day, as a government, you can shut down the border and you say, I'm not gonna let this person physically in, but it's pretty hard for most governments to shut down the internet. So if you have a knowledge job that can be done remotely, you will be competed with on a global level. I think that's like very hard to say it's not gonna happen. It's very hard to stop that. But I think the protections that we care about probably more are for like the Uber driver, the Lyft driver, the DoorDash or TaskRabbit, who doesn't have as much cushion really to deal with some of this global competition.
Great, thanks, Shan. So if we go to that, like, how do we protect some of what are turning out to be some of the most vulnerable people, particularly in the global COVID pandemic? Because for those frontline gig workers, not necessarily the online knowledge workers, what are some of those responsibilities we might have? And what might be that third way we can close that gap? So Janine, if we can start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a responsibility for these workers, especially in the pandemic, because of the safety and health risk. I mean, it's pretty clear with the delivery and the taxi services that this is not just a typical independent contractor. The workers aren't setting the price. They're having to perform in a certain function. They're being managed algorithmically. And the reason when you have labor law, you have basically kind of a tit for tat. You have this what's called a managerial prerogative, and on the other hand, you have a trade-off, which is the workers' rights. So right now, what you're seeing with algorithmic management is that you're having this managerial prerogative, but you're not having the other side of it, which is the workers' rights. So jurisdictions do need to respond, and a lot of them are really concerned. I mean, we've been having a lot of interest by our constituents on this topic, especially for safety and health reasons. I mean, if people get hit on their bicycle when they're delivering, or if they get sick. I mean, these are really, these are real problems that are happening. So, I mean, I think it's just a matter of jurisdictions deciding how they want to give them their protections. I mean, do they want to have them be a new category but then still assign the protections? That's fine. Do they want to classify them as employees? Do they want to change their definition of employees? It doesn't really matter how. And I think that's very much a kind of a jurisdictional choice, but it's clear that the workers do need some sort of protections.
Thank you. Ana Lucia, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, according to what Janine said, it's of course around that. Like the same government has to make a regulation over this, and how are we going to protect the front lines of all these gig economy workers that are in the service industry? Here, a lot in Mexico, you can put the minimum wage and give them access to healthcare. Of course, the type of healthcare is questionable. That's in our discussion, but they have access to free healthcare either way, and that's like a corporate responsibility that also is pushed by the government. That is like, you have to give your employees this cover so they have access to healthcare, and especially during this pandemic, I think is like the insight, and it's like the most main focus to do. And it's like you said, Tari, it's another thing. All the professional workers, that's another point of view. But for the service industry, I think it's a must, but it also has to be pressured by society, pressured by the government, and also pressured for the companies to give them access to all of this.
Great, thank you. So before we go to the next question, if anyone in our audience has a question, I encourage you to put it into the chat and it will come through and we can start lining those up. There is an interesting rebuttal that some people don't want the legislation. They don't want the protection. And again, we're slightly going to conflate issues of flexibility, but there have been some comments that, for example, Lyft drivers don't want to be considered as employees because if there's a minimum pay rate, sometimes people are, Lyft drivers are prevented from logging on in less busy areas because Lyft can't guarantee them that minimum wage. So what might be the worker's response to, no, no, I'm happy to be a gig worker? Have you run into this yet? And Xian, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not exactly a Lyft or Uber situation, but you know, I know a startup here in Singapore. They do a delivery sort of plus type of model, and they have two types of roles. You can be a full-time driver or you can be an ad hoc driver. And they basically compete for labor with Grab and Gojek, who are the other rideshare platforms in the market. And this company actually would prefer to have full-time drivers because they have more scheduled types of delivery. But they actually find it really hard to compete for labor because people prefer the sort of flexibility of Grab and Gojek. And with the surge, they can sort of, you know, on certain weeks and months make more money. So what they found is basically they actually have to go with an older driver population. So, you know, you start out by thinking like, oh, it's going to be these sort of like young people kind of like between things. I'm going to hire them and they would like some money, but they don't want the stability. So they've gone up market to say, okay, I'm going to find these 45 and up drivers who appreciate the CPF, which is the Social Security equivalent contributions, and they want the full-time job even if you don't get the peaks. They would just rather have that stability, but it's pretty hard for them to compete in that segment of the driver market that does prefer flexibility. So I definitely do see that, and I wonder how much of it though is that all of these people are citizens and they all have access to nationalized healthcare. And also young people, I think, care maybe slightly less. They still think they're invincible. So that, you know, it's harder for them to think about retirement savings versus cash in your pocket right now.
Great, thanks, Xian. Ana Lucia, what are you seeing in your business and how you're matching people?
Well, especially where we focus on the most is not on the service industry. We focus most on the professional industry, and people do want the flexibility. They want the gigs in order, like they can have more than one job at a time, but they sure want the flexibility rather than the employment of a full-time. It can be a full-time, but with the flexibility mindset and establishment in there. And I know, I mean, here in my company, we have some people that work here also have another job in somewhere else, and they combined their job here, their knowledge with us and with another client of them. So it's kind of like those types of having two jobs at the same time, it's going to be on the rise in this industry, in the people that have the studies and professional working industry, I think. And also it's part of the gig economy in having more than one gig at the same time, and also having one job at the same time. Probably one can be a temporary job, or can be a permanent job, either way. But this, and also in the labor market, that's what they also are looking for. They're looking for security. They're looking for security for an income, but also for the flexibility. And it can be with one income, it can be with 2 or 3 incomes. And if you're more of a freelancer or entrepreneurial type, you can have more than one gig at the same time and look actively for new clients. So in the industry where I'm more focused on, that's how we're looking at it, that it's been a trend and now it's going to be on the rise in the look of more flexibility, but of course stability in your wage and what you're going to gain, and your healthcare benefits and your protection and your corporate responsibility also, because you have to also change that mindset inside of how you're going to bring those people in, have those people working for you, and then finish the project and then go into the next gig, or keeping them in your company as a more permanent job. It depends. So, okay. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Janine, what's your response to this?
Okay, so I just want to repeat again that we really shouldn't be conflating flexibility then with workers' rights, because they can go hand in hand. So you can hire somebody to be a delivery worker and work 10 hours a week or 5 hours a week. And you could say, okay, whoever logs on now, and then you're paid at an hourly rate and you have the protections for those few hours that you worked. So I don't see any issue there. Now, it could be the case, you know, you were giving the example about Lyft. And so when you had this minimum wage that was introduced in New York City, it meant then that Lyft would say, okay, so you can't then log on and work, from this time, because we don't need anybody at 1 p.m. on Tuesday, because nobody's taking the taxis at that hour, or the rides at that hour. Okay, so that's true. That is definitely true, and that's what the company is going to have to do in order to make the profits that they need, because they're going to have some layouts on labor costs, and then they're going to have to make their profits. So that's what they're going to have to do, and that's standard. I mean, when you look at economic history, right? When you look at this, kind of the way piece rates were done, when people were paying piece rates in factories before there were labor standards, and we're talking about apparel, let's say, in garment production, right? If somebody was paid by the piece, then it didn't matter if there was, clean air going into the building. It didn't matter if there was piles of clothes that were a fire hazard, and it didn't matter how fast or how slow they worked, because they were paid by the piece. When you introduce a minimum wage and you introduced occupational safety and health standards, it forced factories then to redesign their production so that there was actually, corridors that flowed and better air and a certain amount of productivity that could be done in an hour. So this is really what happens when you have regulation, and that's actually a good thing, because in the long run, it's actually good for an economy because it can raise productivity. Yeah, I think that's there.
That's great. Thank you. So there's some very interesting questions from our listeners. Let me just merge two of them right now. That are developing countries better equipped to capitalize on the gig economy? And this is referencing really the global advantage of gig workers. And then there also seems to be a very broad brush of gig workers. The Uber driver is different from some of the more traditional, let's say, knowledge workers. So could you please reflect on that when we're thinking about gig working? So to what extent are developing countries better equipped, and to what extent are we perhaps conflating two different types of gig workers? Maybe a lower skilled gig worker versus a higher skilled gig worker. So Xian, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think that's a great distinction, and I think Janine was trying to set us straight at the beginning on this, which is, let's define our customer segments accurately and talk about them as such. So I would say at the lowest end, the pure sort of like car share, driver share types of things, I think in the developing markets, they are worse off because they just have fewer labor protections in general than in developed economies. I think for knowledge workers, I would also divide them up into different segments. I think there is knowledge work that's sort of like, I don't know how you describe it, sort of, very maybe like 0 to 5 years of experience work. I think that developing markets often have a cost advantage. And as they get smarter and more exposed to what global norms and levels are, they will be very competitive. And you can even see that in Singapore. So even in Singapore, during the lockdown, they shut down the border between Malaysia and Singapore. And the government's going on and on about hire local, hire local. They couldn't find anyone. You can hire graphic designers in Johor Bahru, 30 minutes away across the bridge for a third of the price. It's graphic design, it's not rocket science. You need someone to do the work, and they're willing to do it, and they send it over, and it's done. So even sort of, at the Southeast Asia level, you can already see labor arbitrage happening. I think for like truly like amazing global talent, there are just so few of those people that I don't think developing emerging markets necessarily have an advantage. I think that then it's really about, then the problems become much more around like marketing, like how do I find the work? Verification, how do I prove that I'm good at the thing that I say I'm good at? And then like payment, infrastructure, and things like that. And that's much more about like reputation and verification. But in this sort of like middle of the range type of work, like a lot of the so-called knowledge work that you think about, like, oh, I have this workflow I need to automate, or I have a business I need to make a website for, that stuff can be done cheaply anywhere in the world. You just have to find someone who speaks your language. Although now, with Google Translate, it improves every time. You even don't even have to speak the language. I've seen Chinese entrepreneurs attack the French and Spanish markets with Filipino business process outsourcers just using Google Translate. So the world really is getting a lot flatter if you know how to manipulate all the different parts of it. And so I think that is the real that is the real challenge to this group of workers. And we haven't even started to talk about artificial intelligence and what that's going to do to these people. Yeah, my 2 cents.
Great, Shan. Ana Lucia, I see you nodding your head a lot. What would you like to add?
No, I mean, I think she is totally right. She expressed it correctly, like the way that the word is flatter. And now, if you want to be in the gig economy in this sector, in the knowledge sector, you have to also improve your skills, your selling skills, your marketing skills, because you can have an access to a job, to a gig in any part of the world. And if you speak another language, if you know more than one, I mean, if you have a skill set and everything, you need to expose this to the world and put your resume and your professional jobs and everything profile in what you do and what you want to hire and what you want to acquaint. I mean, a lot of people here in Mexico have gigs from the US that they get for 1/3 of the price that they're going to pay, but they get the job and they do that project and they send it, and they're not Mexican-based clients. And that already happened, and now it's going to be happening a lot more. So I was nodding my head because I'm sure like now it's this type of, what do you have to do to have access to all of these clients that you want to acquire in order to have more gigs, in order to have a bigger job and more income and everything.
Janine, what would you like to add to that? Yeah.
Yeah, so there's definitely a big distinction with the knowledge workers, but there's still a lot of issues that we've been finding with the knowledge workers. So we've done a few studies, mainly of crowd working platforms, so microtask platforms, but also some of the freelancing platforms. And a lot of these, the platforms are all configured differently, so they have different issues, but we do see a lot of issues of non-payment of wages, of people who get into a dispute either with the client or the platform, and then when they try to kind of contact the platform to resolve the dispute, there's radio silence. So there are these kind of these issues that are arising and that do need some sort of policy response, at least at the minimum of dispute resolution. So right now it's a little bit of the wild, wild west on the online knowledge world. And for some people, they're doing great on it, but some people aren't doing great. And going back to what I was saying about kind of my example about the factories and the garment production, in New York, let's say before labor standards came in. A lot of the work is also being, the way that it's being put on the platforms is not so efficient as well for the workers. So we found for the crowds, this is for the microtask platforms that we found, for example, there's so many people on these platforms now that they're all competing against each other for these little jobs. These are like 5-minute jobs or half-an-hour jobs, and they're spending hours and hours and hours looking for work or vetting the client to make sure that the client's actually somebody who's really going to pay them. And so it's actually, there's some really good things, because it means that people who live in countries who couldn't migrate and who didn't have access to jobs can get some income, and they're getting the income in dollars, but they're also not maybe using their time most effectively.
Great, thanks, Janine. Let's stay on the structural side for a little bit, and then I do want to move to that really interesting point about almost the social education cost of doing gig work. But someone in the chat brought up a really interesting question about, since it seems there's types of gig workers, why don't we have a tiered structure of gig workers? And then to bring another viewpoint, if everybody is working across the globe and people can work cross-border, who's actually responsible for these workers? So how does someone advocate? Could we advocate for a tier 1 worker and not a tier 2? So how might we put in some structure into this wild, wild west? So Xian, let me start with you.
Harry, you're just giving me all the hard questions here.
It's a compliment.
I mean, I think the tiers exist already, right? So someone who's doing like image identification for 5 cents on Mechanical Turk is really different from someone who's doing like a freelance, data science project for 50K or whatever it is. And so that tiering already exists. The question of like who advocates for them is a really interesting one. And on the topic of sort of non-payment and dispute resolution, it's interesting, Janine, because I would have thought that actually the platforms would be interested in solving that, right? That you would want to be the platform that was known for like highest payment rates. And I would build an escrow function, which is not a new idea, and lots of people do it. And you know, I would only release payment on proof of work and sort of both people kind of opting in. And so that does seem to me that something that can be resolved without policy intervention. Um, on the advocating thing, I don't actually know a great answer to that. I think the interesting part of like if you could live anywhere in the world to do whatever job you wanted, where do people end up living? And you know, all these governments are trying to attract sort of these knowledge workers. And so then once you've got them, does the government then feel obligation to advocate for them, even if it is outside their own jurisdiction? And I don't know the answer to that. Janine probably has better perspective given her more global purview.
Yeah, thanks, Shan. Janine?
Okay, so there are some platforms that do dispute resolution, but the problem is that they're not exactly neutral arbiters because the platform has an incentive to side with the client. So that's one of the issues. Other platforms don't have it, or some sort of private arbitration where we would argue that it needs to be some sort of neutral body that's doing that sort of arbitration. Now, as far as so last year, the ILO had a global commission on the future of work. And one of the recommendations that came out of it was to have some sort of international governance mechanism that could actually at least deal with dispute resolution and at least deal with some of the basics of how we regulate working conditions. And one of the examples that that was cited in the report is our Maritime Labor Convention, which is from 2006. So seafarers have been around for hundreds of years, and there's always been problems with seafarers. There continue to be problems with seafarers, but it's gotten better. But there is a convention in place right now. So you have workers from all over the world, going all over the world on boats that run from flag states from all over the world. So this is very much kind of like what you see in the virtual sphere, except that it's physical. And so what you have now is a system that's been put in place that you have certain minimum standards, you have a minimum wage, you have certain minimum rights, you have payment for these workers into their national social security funds. And then when the ship goes into a port, there is now a system of labor inspection of these ships to make sure that they're complying with the working conditions. And if they're not, the ship is grounded, which is very costly. So this is just an example of how something could be done. And we need to be thinking about how we could do something like this in the virtual space. Because I mean, right now it's you know, in the percentage, if you look at the labor force numbers of, you know, the percentage of people doing this kind of work, it's not huge, but it's obviously something that's going to grow. And I think with COVID, we're seeing more online work and the potential, you know, the more people discover that there can be growth here, the more that there is going to be growth here, which just separates it very much from the service work, where, I mean, there's a limit to how many, you know, taxi drivers and delivery workers you need. But here there really is a potential for growth. So I really do think there's a need from some sort of international system that can at least govern basic working conditions. Because even if you're very high skilled, it is a competitive labor market. You know, this is now a planetary labor market where you know, the Filipinos are competing with the Bangladeshis, with the Indians, with the Ukrainians. I mean, we did it when we first launched our survey in 2015 on the Crowdflower platform and the Amazon Mechanical Turk platform. There was workers from 75 countries in this one survey that we launched. You know, so this is very much a planetary labor market. And although some people can command good wages, the more people that get on, the more you're going to see pressure and perhaps a weakening of labor conditions. So it's just something, you know, there's no easy answer, and that's not something that's going to be happening, you know, overnight, but it's something that we need to be thinking about.
Great, thanks, Janine. So Ana Lucia, from your perspective, what's your reaction to either some international labor standards where someone would be looking at your entity, or on the other side, let's say unionization of employees so they can advocate for themselves?
I think, as they both here mentioned, it's something that with time and with the growing market of this economy and of this type of workers, there's going to be more regulations and rules and restrictions and everything, and also all the support that we need by either making a union or being in the way of internalizing. Right now, I mean, the way that you can protect, and of course, like how Janine said, it's in order for the client, like it's in favor for the client always in all these platforms where you can have a freelance job and everything. I think we start from there. Like, how can you protect the person that is doing this job, this gig, and also the client that is receiving this gig? Because of course, the client wants to ensure that he or she is going to receive what this freelancer is offering. So, and you can do it by a contract, probably by an international law contract or something, because it's like, where is it being ruled, in your country or in the client's country? And that's like the tricky question. So I think, like they both mentioned, with this economy growing, it's how the rules are going to start being set, because it's still new. I mean, given the number of people that are part of this world. So when this number increases, I'm sure it's going to be in the next 3 years, we're going to have a better point of view of how everything resolves in this part.
Great, thanks, Ana Lucia. So let's go back to some of the earlier comments when we were talking about whether it is the delivery person or the knowledge worker who is hustling for their next gig, and they're spending hours online and it may be low paid. So 2 aspects in there. What's the responsibility to the worker, because they may have lower social outcomes? They may not be getting education, they may not be upskilling, it may not be a good use of their time. So how do we serve those workers who might be stagnating? And then on a technology side, what is it saying about those different platforms that we're not bridging and keeping workers onto platforms that are effective for them? How can we increase loyalty on platforms and increase the workers' experience? Who wants to start? Shan, I'm not going to start with you. Janine, would you like to start?
I was ready, Terry. I was going to volunteer already. I'll take the technology one because I do think I have a better perspective on that. Actually, I think you're starting to see that emerging. So we actually invested in a platform that is actually run by workers for workers. And so they very consciously said, we're not going to do a take rate model. Actually, the only people on the platform are going to be people who've done independent work, who want to showcase their work, and who can refer and reference other people they've worked with in the past. And if you as an employer want to hire anyone on this platform, you're going to pay a subscription. And so the platform is actually constructed from the point of view of the worker. So it's not a union in the conventional sense, but it is an agglomeration of talent that has said, you know, we want to have a little bit more power in this relationship. But also, I think it's trying to address some of these issues that we talked about of like reputation and proof of work, in that I say this is my portfolio, and I said these are the people I worked with on this project. And then, you know, you have those people's real identities and you can see their portfolios too. So you can also see, like, it's not just one person, you can see what little teams of independent workers are doing as well. So I think you do see some of that. We definitely see some of that emerging in the higher skilled ends of the gig economy. And then on the lower end, it's less of a technology solution, but I do see teams of drivers collaborating in some markets that we're investors in. But they're not as technically oriented. So they're not really building scalable solutions for lots of drivers. They're just optimizing for them and their friends to try to sort of manage against the platforms.
Great, thanks, Sheann. So Janine, if you could pick up on the thread of what is this doing for someone's social mobility or their education if people are really hustling for micro gigs and spending hours doing this and then not getting paid? Is there a broader societal implication?
All right. Okay, just I wanted to say what Sheann is actually describing, or I would call them cooperatives, and I think that's actually a really good model for the virtual world. That is really a kind of a promising way forward. Okay, so how can workers move forward I mean, what we saw from our studies, so we did a study of 1,000 workers in Ukraine, for example, who are working on digital labor platforms. And it's very much an individual's initiative to train themselves, and a lot of them did. And this is especially true with the kind of the higher tier knowledge workers, the people, the IT programmers, or even the designers, who are constantly trying to learn the latest in programming software and improve their skills. But of course, they're the ones who are assuming that cost and doing that on their own. But on the other hand, by working on the platforms, they got exposure to types of work that they wouldn't have gotten exposure to, in the offline world. So in that respect, for them, it was actually a really good thing. So again, I mean, there is this really big distinction between the kind of the tiers of workers, and I think for the ones that are highly qualified, there's not so much of an issue. For workers at the lower end, we don't see a real skilling, and there's concerns about de-skilling. On our studies of the microtask platforms, we have a lot of Indian workers, a lot of them with university education, sometimes with postgraduate education in STEM fields. So very, very well-trained individuals who are then spending their time doing content moderation or tagging data, and it's not a good use of their skills. And what really concerns me personally is a lot of these people were young people who were coming out of university, started working on these platforms. They spend several years doing this, and then at the end of the day, let's say they decide that they're tired of this and they want, an offline job. They have really no way of showing that they've been doing this work. So how you even go to a prospective employer and say, oh, hey, I've been working on Amazon Mechanical Turk for 5 years. My ID number is XYZ, and these are my star ratings. But it's very tricky for the person. So I think this whole issue of career transitions is something that does need a little bit more work. So one thing that maybe platforms could do would be also how your work history on platforms, if there's a way, some sort of solution on how people could transfer their work histories with them. This would also give workers a little bit more mobility for shifting to different platforms that are preferential to them. Because right now you spend so much time building your reputation on platforms that it's hard then to move to another platform. And so as a result, what you have is basically a monopsony, which is not ideal for the worker.
Great, thanks, Janine. Ana Lucia, what would you say to that?
I also think from the point of view of the corporate, like I think it's also a corporate responsibility to keep reskilling your same employees. I mean, I think it's part of like what you have to do, because it also, if you as a company don't look in how you're going to train your employees or your contractors or your gig workers to improve, you're going to be out of people to hire, because they're not going to be enough skill sets to be able to cover all of your jobs in your company. So I think it's also part of what the corporate responsibility has to migrate also, and how they're going to invest in training, and how because they should prefer to do that, so they can have a higher skill set talent in every case, in either in the service, in the low level, in the high level, in whatever level, there's a lack of talent right now. So if we keep dividing that gap of knowledge, of skills and everything, it's going to be wider, and the company is not going to have access to this talent and to this training and education. So I think it's part of the company that they can have a training area where they can help their employees or their contractors and everything acquire more education and skill sets and everything, so they can jump into the next level. It's part, I think, of a employment thing or company thing that we're going to be seeing in the near future.
Great, thanks, Ana Lucia. So we just have 6 minutes left. So what I'd love to do is just go around our speakers, and if you could leave our listeners just with one thought with regard to the gig economy, what would that be? And Xian, I am going to start with you on this one.
One thought. I mean, I think, my one thought is really, I think societies have to push their governments to be much more active in engaging in this topic of how do we provide benefits, how do we prepare our citizens, how do we ensure that we're equipping our people to adequately compete in this global talent marketplace, whether it is about healthcare or unemployment benefits or retirement, or whether it's about upskilling. And that's, I think, you know, I think that's probably my one sort of takeaway on that. I think it's much harder to, you know, wait for the good-hearted capitalists to try to do right by their people. There will be some subset who will, you know, be the Costcos of the world, but most people are not. And so it does require regulation and a real conversation about changing structural things. In Singapore, it's kind of funny. They give out this thing called a skills future credit. So every citizen gets $500 to spend on taking a class to improve themselves. And it's just to get people into that feeling that learning stuff is a lifelong pursuit. It doesn't even actually have to be directly related to your work. And then there's other programs on top of that are trying to get people to upskill. But I think it is a really challenging problem, right? I think the left side of the distribution, that bottom 20%, it's just really, really hard. And I think, you know, a lot of policymakers are cracking their brains trying to come up with a solution for this. And so I think it does going to require a lot of strong stomachs on the political side and clever civil servants to figure out what to do there.
Great. Thank you, Shan. So Janine, this is a natural segue to you. So what's your one thought you want to leave people with?
Okay, well, first of all, I mean, I agree very much with Shan. And I just want to emphasize that regulation, policy making, these are constant things. These are something that always needs to be done. I mean, you see this in the tax sphere. There's always changes in regulation to keep up with whatever new invention is being done in the corporate world or in the business world. So this is something that's natural. So what I get very annoyed when I hear, well, oh, but these labor laws are from so long ago, as if the world has changed and we don't need things anymore. We need them. We need to adapt them because the world has changed, and we need to kind of have new solutions, but we need them. Because you can't just depend on, you know, kind of social assistance or social protection systems. The more that there is inequality in the labor market, the more pressure then is going to be on your social assistance and your tax and transfer systems. So the more equality that you have in the labor market, because you have labor protections in place, the less then you need these other kind of safety nets. So yeah, this is, you know, this is work that is continuous, that will never end, and that we all need to be a part of, certainly our governments, but also ourselves as citizens, a business community, and trade unions and other associations.
Great, thank you. And Lucia, what's your closing thought for listeners?
I would also see it from the company's point of view. How are you going to become, like, that would be my thought. How are you going to be a company? How are you going to evolve into a company that has access and also is attracted, or people in the gig economy, workers from all levels are attracted to you as a company? Because at the end, we rely on talent to keep growing our company. So how are we going to be that company that talent wants to work for us and with us, with those skill sets and upskilling and everything? So I think I would look at that point of view, because we have to adapt also our corporation, our rules and regulations inside our companies to be able to hire people in this type of agile industry and everything, to work and have the best talent for us working in that project, in that gig, or temporary or permanent. But I see it from that point of view. Of also, I mean, of course it's the government, but also I think the change, at least here in Mexico, a lot of changes start by companies. A lot of companies do something and then it gets regulated by the government. So I would change the way of how we see things and be like, evolve those companies for this type of skilled workers, and then the government will follow.
Great, thank you very much. So on behalf of the Milken Institute and Global Wonks, I want to say a huge thank you to Xian, Janine, and Ana Lucia. If any of our listeners do have follow-up questions, feel free to send them in, and hopefully we can have another spirited discussion and continue this topic. But again, thank you very much for your participation. This was honestly one of the highlights of my day. So, great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you, Terry.